Hi everyone. I am finally going to sit down and do videos on the Minor Arcana because clearly that's the next step for me. I hope you're all having, what's left of it anyway, a great summer. Um, and yeah, I think the reason I've waited so long to do this is because I haven't really thought of the best way of organizing the videos and organize how I want to talk about them. So I thought what I would do is use the guy who I trust with all my esoteric stuff, Mr. Crowley, and follow his scheme for talking about the minors. And of course, those of you who've read the Book of the Law, the Book of Thoth, excuse me, know that he organizes it where he talks about all of the ones of the same number first, and then he goes into the individual suits and talks about each card individually. So I'm going to actually talk about each of all of the ones at once, all of the twos at once, etc. And hopefully that way we can all get a general idea for what the number itself and the sephira itself represents. And then I'm going to do separate videos for each of the individual cards. So we're going to jump right in. I don't have anything prepared. This is going to be all off the top of my head, so here we go. First we start, of course, with the aces, and they are right here. The aces for me always represent, and as they should for everyone, they always represent seeds of potential. In readings, I find them to be in some ways the most ambiguous cards because they sometimes don't ever manifest. I've had many situations in life where I've done readings, and sometimes the final outcome or the future outcome is an ace. And sometimes it comes into being, sometimes it does not. Aces are very, very tenuous in general. I think all aces really are is just they represent opportunities for something to happen. They don't necessarily represent actual, at least in my experience, they don't represent actual events happening. Um, though they can eventually. They have to be grounded in something realistic first. But they simply represent the basic potential for things. So, and we can apply those to that idea to the meanings of each suit. Basically, the Ace of Wands, therefore, is the potential for some sort of creative endeavor. It's an opportunity to start a new project or something that one is ambitious about or very motivated about. It is an opportunity to create. It doesn't necessarily mean that someone's going to definitely get a new job or something like that, but it can represent the potential for that. And we go through all the suits like that. Um, I'll talk more about each individual card in their individual videos. For now, let's just keep going with the idea of the numbers. So then we have the number 2, um, which for all the minors usually represent some kind of polarity happening. Because, of course, with the number 2, we get the first idea of duality. And with the number 2 is something able to come from nothing, because without the number 2, if we leave it at just the number 1, 1 repeats itself over and over again. It's with the number 2 that we get some sort of division, we get something that is different from this, and therefore we can create an interaction between the two that represents the formation of something different, if that makes any sense. By creating difference, we can create something tangible eventually. With the number 2 and 3, though, we don't have anything tangible really yet, at least philosophically. But the number 2, I think the interesting thing with the number 2, with the Two of Wands, is that the Two of Wands doesn't necessarily speak too much to an idea of polarity. Um, I think it's kind of hard to see the Two of Wands as having something to do with polarity. Um, but all the others, for sure, the Two of Cups is about the harmonious kind of good vibes that can happen between opposites. The Two of Swords is how they can that their effects kind of cancel each other out sometimes as well. And the Two of Discs is more about how their interaction becomes, in the real world, becomes sort of an alternation back and forth. So we have the number two in all of its different philosophical ideas. I guess with fire, it's the most archetypal idea of the number two, and so with the number two becoming an idea of division, I guess we can say that in the highest aspect of the idea of division is something that does have to do with boldness. Of course, a lot of the characteristics of the Two of Wands come from the astrological things, but that's something that I'm going to have to think about more for the video I do on the Two of Wands. But I do think that we can easily say that all of the twos have to do with the separation of the original element idea in the aces, and the solidification of them into something that's a little more easy to comprehend, and something that can become the basis for the creation of something actual and solid. And that's really what leads us into number three, because of course the number three is when we get the idea of formation. Of course, the number one is totally undefinable. You can't say anything about the ace. The ace for any suit is very ambiguous. It simply represents potential. The number two represents more of kind of the energy of that suit, sort of that suit's idea in its most, in its almost in its purest form. The idea of the wand suit is very much about power and creation and the will to power, the will to create. Whereas the two of well, let's say the two of swords, for instance, is all about division and the interaction between opposing forces and how those can clash, basically. And that's sort of the entire idea of the sword suit, that when you have all these different beings and different willpowers that are focused or unfocused in various ways, you get kind of anarchy and confusion. And that's sort of what all the entire sword suit is about. In the case of the threes for me always represent kind of the overall shape and the overall, I don't quite want to say nature, but I kind of want to say the form that the suit tends to come in. Its most ideal form, its ideal vessel, basically. If the two is kind of like, I always use this analogy of basically, what's the analogy I used to use? I think I used to use basically a seed analogy, where the ace is very much like a seed. The two is kind of like the DNA, and the three is sort of the process by which that DNA can manifest itself, if that makes any sense. It's basically the ideal vessel for that code to grow in, is kind of what I tend to see the threes as. So for instance, the Three of Wands is all about the fertilization of something, or the establishment of some kind of plan, some kind of goal setting. Crowley associates it with the ego and pride and ambition and stuff like that, and confidence. But I think that, yes, that's one aspect of the Three of Wands, but the three is always about the the coming up of some kind of plan, really, some kind of ideal, auspicious goal that you want to make manifest, that you work towards making manifest. Uh, Whereas the three of swords, just continue with those two suits that we've been working with. If the two of swords is about division and the sort of balanced interaction between forces, because the number two is so strong, the number three shows us the shape of that division, um, it's so hard to explain the number three, and I don't know if any of you have similar problems with the number three, um, because it's such a strange number. Perhaps because the number three represents more duality than the number two actually does in some ways. Um, Oddly enough, and that's just because of the nature of the feminine. But the Three of Swords, as the Lord of Sorrow, shows us that the form of division, the actual ideal, the best possible form for division to take in the intellectual realm, is one of sadness, and that the root of all, or rather um, the root of all sadness is division. It's a very Buddhist statement, that separation from unity is that which is the cause of any kind of sadness, depression, longing, etc., loneliness. Um, and we can say the same thing with the Three of Discs. If the Two of Discs is about the alternation between gain and loss, things coming and going in the material plane, then the three represents the actual form of what that actually does. And what that does is it builds things. The Three of Discs is all about building things. Um, and so the idea inherent in that is that you cannot actually build anything or create anything solid. Um, you cannot really bring anything together in the material world without also having that inherent principle of flux in all things. Um, Things have to be able to change in order to come together, to coagulate, and to eventually come apart as well. At least that's how I would rationalize it. So let's move on from the three to the four. And the number four is, of course, always about stability and order and very masculine, very um, usually very benevolent energy, but very static energy. We're told in Kabbalah that the number four is sort of representative of Keter, below the abyss. That Chesed, as the number four, mercy, represents Keter, in that Chesed is simply all the potential energy and purpose of the supernal triangle. It's all of that contained almost like in a little box. Chesed is kind of like, in some ways, almost like Pandora's box in a sense, in that all this stuff that can possibly happen is contained in it. And it really isn't until the number five that stuff gets broken open and is unleashed. So the number four is always very static and very rigid. So with the number with the Four of Cups, for instance, we get this sense of kind of emotional lockdown. There's neither happiness nor sadness. It's sort of just dull, blasé kind of basic emotion. And because it's the number four, it's good, but it isn't necessarily particularly active. It isn't necessarily good for that element. So all the fours have to do with very solid ideas, very structure oriented. Of course, the number four is associated with so many things that we think of in terms of structure. North, south, east, and west, the four seasons. There are so many things. What was I? There was one more I thought. Um, but anywho, uh, things that are very structured tend to come in fours. You know, the square, of course, being sort of the fundamental idea of construction and of buildings, is, of course, four-sided. So all of the fours are, again, very structured, very organized, which is perfectly shown in the Four of Swords. I think the whole idea of organization, as we think of it in terms of governance, in terms of creating some kind of ordered hierarchy or system. That's what the Four of Swords is all about. Whereas the Four of um, Pentacles, or the Four of Discs rather, is more about the organization of and stability of one's material possessions. It's all the bounty that is possible in the supernal triangle made manifest. It's just sort of stuck there in a way. And it's very rigid because it's earth and the heaviest of elements. It's very dense and not going anywhere. So we get this idea of sort of an impenetrable fortress. And all of these really, once we get below the supernal triangle, a lot of the cards on either the Pillar of Mercy or the Pillar of Severity really need to be evaluated against each other. You know, you can't really understand the fours unless you really understand the fives and their purpose, or the sevens and the eights. The middle pillar functions a lot differently in that they harmonize the energies of the two on the opposite sides. So for the number 5, which is what we have next, Gibora, we get the idea of the 4 put in a state of kind of anarchy. Whatever energy is contained in the 4 is put into some sort of state of stress. Some aggression is thrust upon it, basically, in order to make it move. Gibora is, in my book, very much a reflection of time in the material world. I realize that Bina is more like that, in that Bina is associated with Saturn, who is, of course, the god of time. But the time of Bina is so different from the time of Gibora. Gibora is... Bina rather is the time of eternity. You know, the idea of the basic raw idea of things moving through space and therefore creating time. You know, and it's eternal. It's sort of the basic idea of all time. Whereas Gibora is simply the gears of the universe as they move. Basically, you know, it's that force that keeps the universe moving. It's more of a tangible sense of time, I think. At least that's how I interpret it. In the same way that chesed is sort of a more tangible idea of the number 2. The number 2 is all about division and creation of polarity, and therefore the creation of some sort of actual current of energy, of willpower. And the 4 is all about, I guess you would say it's the structuring of that duality. I think we, as human beings, can better understand the idea of duality when we think of it, at least logically speaking, in terms of the number 4, if that makes any sense. Whereas the number 2, I suppose, is a little more esoteric. I don't know. The relationship between 2 and 4 is something that I've always had a little difficulty with. 3 and 5 is a lot easier. It's a lot more cut and dry because they're so similar. Chesed being sort of a little bit of Keter, a little bit of Hokmah, and a little bit of Bina, is kind of confusing to me in terms of what sephira above it do you most associate it with. But anywho, that's neither here nor there. All we have to really know is that the 5s represent some kind of stress being put on the four. So from the number, from the Four of Cups, for instance, which was all about emotional lockdown and sort of emotional blaseness, the five represents a diminishing of that. If the four is too much of a good thing, the five is too little of a good thing. It sort of cuts away all the excess pleasure and leaves you with this sort of dry grossness that feels really lacking in happiness. It's like all these good things have been taken away from you, which is probably why Pamela Coleman Smith drew the Five of Cups in her deck the way that she did. Um, and to continue on, the Four of Swords is like is all about peace and organization, and the Five of Swords is in some ways anarchy. It's kind of like what happens when you take away the order or do something to destabilize the order that should be natural. Um, so yeah, and by creating that, I almost want to say like a vacuum, but by creating that um, need, you create a dichotomy in the physical world as opposed to the supernal triangle, which is ideal. In the tangible world, when you create a polarity, you are able to create history. You are able to create events happening in a specific space and time. We can now say, with the addition of 4 and 5, that this exact thing happened to this being 10 minutes ago, and something different happened to the same being 20 minutes later, you know. Whereas before, you can't really say that before the number 4 and 5. You can simply say, this being is, and this is what its will is over the course of its entire existence. This is its eternal framework. You know, the supernal triangle is very untouchable. So the numbers 1 through 3 are very idealistic, very very pure. You can't really mess with them. And then 4 and 5 down, you get all the mishigas of life, really. So after the number 5, we get the number 6. And 6 is super balanced, super happy. They're all the best cards in the deck. 6 represents being on the middle pillar. It represents the essence of Keter in the material world, basically. It is the closest thing to understanding Keter that we can possibly get to in this life, basically. Using human logic, using a human way of looking at things. 6 is the best way of looking at Keter. It is the direct representative of Keter in the physical world or in the manifest world. And so all the 6s are very balanced. They represent the purest, most harmonized aspect of their suit that one can actually say is more real in some ways. It's funny going back and forth between looking at the minor arcana as divinatory statements and what they represent as philosophical ideas, because the two are very different. If you want to understand the minor arcana from a divinatory perspective, it can be, of course, very useful, but I think you miss out on some of the subtleties of the minors if you look at them simply as literal events. I think it's best to look at them more philosophically and then work from there, but that's just me. So all the 6s are very balanced. They always represent the interaction and the union in many ways of masculine and feminine. How those two seemingly totally opposite forces can and do in fact interact with each other in such a way as to create harmony and a very balanced, beautiful, perfect idea. So with the 6, we get a balancing of the 4 of whatever and the 5 of whatever. So for instance, if the 4 of Wands was all about the manifestation and the completion of someone's task or project. It's sort of, the Four of Wands for me is always like when God finishes creation and says it's good and then rests. The Four of Wands is kind of like that. Let's take a breather and enjoy what we've finished making. The Five is all about the anarchy that can come from that. You know, so the Five of Wands for me is all about kind of like Satan's rebellion. If you think of Paradise Lost, the Five is when something rebels against God and creates an aggressive force. With the Six of Wands, we get a harmonization between the two, and we get the idea of victory. That there is, yes, there is still conflict, but it is done in such a way that is almost peaceful. It's there has been some sort of conflict, but it is over. You know, so with the Six of Wands, there is a clear victor. There's a clear idea um, of conquest, of oh boy, of putting an end to conflict, you know, and yet there it still has been one. I think it's still important to remember that because the six still comes after five. You know, the six does not ignore the happening of the number five. You know, these do go in order, and you do have to see them as following each other in succession. You know, if we follow the path of the swords, because we've been talking using the swords a lot, the Four of Swords, if it's about peace and order and organization, the Five of Swords is about destabilization. The Six of Swords is more about. I kind of want to describe the six as the interplay of order and chaos, in a sense, in that the Six of Swords is all about uh, trial and error, I think, and experimentation and learning things through trial and error, trying to use logic in a very balanced and orderly fashion in a way that does not necessarily accept the status quo. Um, if that makes sense. It's all about the Six of Swords is all about figuring something out rather, for oneself using one's own experience and gauge of experience in order to interpret that experience, if that makes sense. So it is sort of a little bit of both, and then the astrological stuff sort of rounds out the whole idea. So that's the number six. With the number seven is horrible, as we all know. The number seven is just like the worst number for the minors, and that is because supposedly the number seven is the lowest number on the pillar of mercy, and so it represents a just a burst of force that is not necessarily all that pure. It's so far down the tree of life that we no longer have an idea of balance as much. Having passed the number six, which is all about balance, we are no longer functioning like that. So with the seven, we get this whole idea of destabilization and just weakness. It's a weak number, and Crowley sees it, and it's very sexist, but he does see it being Venus as a very feminine number, and so therefore it's not as strong. And from a philosophical standpoint, that is true. Obviously, from an actual human standpoint, it's not necessarily true. So again, we sort of have to deal with sexist philosophy more in terms of evaluating positive versus negative, and not necessarily, you know, man versus woman, even though the two sexes do represent those two energies in different ways. But with the number seven, we get a lot of mess. The Seven of Wands is all about struggle and putting too much energy in and trying really hard. The Seven of Cups is about, you know, way too much of a good thing to the point where it becomes poisonous. The Seven of Swords is too much of a desire for peace, too much of a desire for um, stability and following orders in some ways. You know, the seven is all about being a yes man and doing what other people tell you and not doing what you actually know is right. And the seven of pentacles or discs is all about um, a tremendous amount of work. But it's also a tremendous amount of heaviness. It's a tremendous amount of just stagnation. It's a card that represents way too much stagnation. It's just way too heavy, way too dense, way too dull. There's no energy in the seven of discs to really get it anywhere. So whatever progress one is trying to make in the material world with the whole path of the pentacles hits a real roadblock at the seven. With the number 8, however, we get things moving again. The 8s are all about expansion, movement, things happening very quickly, very rapidly, and a lot of logical ideas. It's sort of like intellectualism being the power of intellectualism. So with the 8, we get the idea of the fire suit in an intellectual way, which is all about energy and willpower, and it's sort of just like a burst of energy. It doesn't really have much of a target. It's sort of just all at once. But at least it's got slightly more direction. You know, the 7 is sort of just brute force, whereas the 8 is slightly more, I guess, slightly more focused than the 7. But it's a lot faster. You know, the 7 has got a little more meat to it, I guess. With the 8 of Cups, we get the logical reaction to the 7 of Cups. You know, if the 7 of Cups is debauchery and investing way too much in pleasure, then the 8 is the intellectual realization that that is not necessarily, that does not actually yield anything important, really, that it really yields only transitory pleasure and that there's not much actual purpose to it. And the 8 of Swords is all about thinking, overthinking, way too much thinking on one's mind, and therefore not being able to necessarily move out of it. And the Eight of Pentacles is all about logic being applied to material things. So it's a card of agriculture and sowing seeds and taking care of them over a long period of time. It's about cautiousness and prudence and everything like that. We're almost done. I know this is much longer than I had wanted to, but you know me. I hope y'all don't mind. With the 9, the 9 is a strange number as well, because on one hand it is, of course, the harmonization of 7 and 8, but it is also the reflection of Tiferet, and so it is on a lower arc. It is a representation of the alternation between forces. It is the current of alternation, because of course it's ruled by, Yesod is ruled by the moon, and the moon is all about fluctuation. And so on this level, we're seeing those two polar opposites that Keter is really all about all the way at the top. No longer are they working as a unity, they're working in tandem as they do in the 6. Now things are so low that they are able to maintain their divisibility, but they are sort of flowing back and forth in flux. So they're still kind of working together, but there's more of an idea of back and forthness, if that makes sense, of alternation. Whereas there is not so much of that. There's more of an idea of cohesiveness with the number 6. I hope that makes sense. With the 9s, we do get this idea of fluctuation back and forth, but also great force and strength. The number 9 is all about perfection, actually, but also being Yesod meaning foundation. The number 9 is incredibly powerful. So with the 9 of Wands, we get the idea of force as applied over a long period of time, and it sort of ebbs and flows enough as to be consistent. So it's kind of tired out, but it is able, because of its ability to go back and forth, and sort of recuperate over time. It's able to go the distance, so to speak. The Nine of Cups is all about the Nine of Cups is a little tricky, but the Nine of Cups is really this very strong acquisition of something that one finds pleasurable. Um, it's sort of it's a little. I think the influence of the moon is so strong in the Nine of Cups that there is something very elusive about it, and I think the astrological aspects of the Nine of Cups really make the Nine of Cups the Nine of Cups. I think it's just good to understand the Nine of Cups as in terms of the number nine as being just very strong and very balanced, being on the middle pillar. The water cards in the middle pillar really are the best. The ones on the sides are a little devious here and there because of the nature of water. The Nine of Swords is very aggressive. It's very strong, just very angsty card. Very just it's a lot of intense mental energy. And the Nine of Pentacles or Discs is all about um, is all about it is about gain. And I think the Nine of Pentacles is more about I see the Nine of Pentacles as about beauty and aesthetics, and so I do think that some of that comes from the interplay between masculine and feminine. Um, but anywho, I'm going to try to talk about some more of these specifics in the individual videos again. We finally get now to the number 10, and the number 10 is about completion and the full manifestation of something in its most tangible and yet most changeable form. What I love about Crowley's interpretations is that he takes that into consideration, that the material world, being the material world, is all about flux and changeability. And so all of the tens have very transitory effects. In Waite's deck, they take on a much more like, this is going to last a very long time. They have this big weightiness to them that I don't necessarily agree with. Um, I can see where he gets that from, but I also I prefer to think of Earth as much more changeable and much more under the command of the spirit, which keeps things moving, than under the command of matter, which sort of just sits there. Um, so for the tens, we get these very intense but very passing ideas. So the Ten of Wands is all about force being applied very brutishly, very basically, very it's very manipulative and controlling, of course. And it's energy at its last gasp, as Crowley says. It's so desperate to survive that it does everything it can to survive. The Ten of Cups is incredibly fleeting. It's finally getting what one thinks that they want. It's sort of the completion of one's happiness, but realizing that one still needs more. You will always need more. Happiness that one gets out of the cups is very transient. The best kinds of happiness come more from self-activation, really, than from getting any specific fantasy completed or any specific desire fulfilled. With the Ten of Swords, we get the guillotine. Very quick, very transitory. Life goes on, even though it sucks. And the Ten of Pentacles is very is all about the ability of material possessions to be here one day and gone the next. It's accumulation, and it's the heaviest of all the pentacles in some ways, being the lowest down. But because of all the influence of Mercury in the card, we are able to get things moving again. There's a purpose being placed to being allocated to the stuff that one has accumulated. So So yeah, I hope that that kind of gives us a general overview. I'd like to, next take each of these cards individually and make separate videos about them. Um, so yeah, if you have any questions, uh, please let me know as always. And I hope that this was helpful or interesting or anything like that, and can give us a basis to work on for the next few videos. Okay, thank you so much for watching, and take care. And thank you for all subscribing, liking, etc. Please keep that up. So thank you so much, and talk to you soon.